time frame is a bit awkward, and agreeing to sign the landlord's then current standard form lease, we don't know what's going to be in that. Just because it says standard form doesn't make it reasonable or fair or even suitable for a dental office. Other problems that you see with it?
It should be determined by arbitration based on market rent for renewing tenants in the building. Again, if a lawyer is just sitting there at a desk, they don't have that square footage that you've invested in with all of your equipment, and knowing that equipment has to move, and if you were to have a whole other year lost, it becomes incredibly expensive to do market rent.
I'm going to explain that a little bit further, but you're correct. The rent shall not be determined or shall be determined by arbitration based on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building is definitely a problem. I'll get more into that in just a second. Let's see where some of the other ones are. Yes? In 9 months, the current rent could change a whole lot. I would agree with you. Let's take a look at this point by point. This first line here, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. Why would that be a problem? Yes?
Selling your practice.
Selling your practice. Because if you want to sell your practice, one of the first things that a prospective purchaser is going to do is they're going to ask for a copy of your lease agreement. They're going to see if this option to extend can be transferred to them, because they have to rely on that option to extend, because they don't want to buy your practice and then go through the cost of having to relocate it. If that's the case and they have to relocate your practice, how much is your practice going to be worth at that point in time? A whole lot less. So you want to make sure that these options to renew are not specific to the original tenant, which is quite common. Actually, it's quite common here in Nevada. I see them a lot, or used to, and I think you had that originally in it as well. So you have to be careful with that. Let me carry on here. And if the tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent and has performed its covenants and obligations under this lease and has not been in default. What do you notice about the word default? Which means it's what? It's a defined term elsewhere in the lease. And so if you flip through that 30 or 40 page lease document and see what the definition of default means, you're going to be pretty surprised. So the definition of default in most leases is a non-payment of rent when it becomes due and payable at the beginning of every month. And so over the course of a 120-month lease term, there's a pretty high likelihood that you may miss paying the rent by even a day. And if that's the case, it's possible that the landlord could say, hey, your option to renew is no longer valid because you missed paying the rent back 3 or 4 years ago. As long as they've correctly diarized that in their books. And so what you see here is a classic example when they're tying it into default is you're tying the tenant's right to exercise this provision to your performance under the lease. And if you're going to do that, you need to make sure that you as the tenant have a right to cure any technical default before going in, or you have the right to cure a breach under the lease before going into a technical default where you begin to lose rights and privileges under these lease agreements, which could ultimately cost you a lot of money. Because if you lose this option to renew, what happens to you at the end of your term? Possibly. It means you no longer have the right to stay. Now, the landlord may renew with you, but could be a whole lot more expensive depending on what the market conditions are that year. Yes, doctor?
I have a question based on where it says, we talked about not being able to sell your practice. Is there anything in these lease agreements that has anything to do with if you are become disabled or if you become...
That's a good question. The question is there anything in these leases that protect you if you become disabled? Typically not. You have to specifically write those in. These leases are very much a buyer beware. You have to make sure, especially if you are the sole practitioner and the business relies on you personally being in good health and in good form to conduct the business, that if something happens to you, and this is a death and disability, we put one in your lease, that if you are no longer able to practice for whatever reason and you go through it, that you can terminate the lease on some reasonable notice, perhaps with a small penalty, and then be able to get out. And we'll get into a little bit more of that in just a bit. But good question. Let me carry on here. After default, it says, it shall have the option to renew this lease for a further term of 5 years exercisable by written notice to the landlord no less than 9 months prior to the end of term. And as you correctly pointed out, Doctor, that 9 months is a bit awkward. A lot of tenants think that it's 6 months, or a lot of tenants think that it might be a year. But 9 months is an easy date to actually miss. So I like these things to be usually 6 months prior to the end of term. But again, sometimes the windows can be very narrow. You want to make sure that you can actually, like this one says, you can actually exercise your option to renew here anytime up to and including 9 months prior to the end of term. A lot of leases will say you can't exercise it until till 9 months, but before 6 months. You've got to watch those narrow windows. Oops. Any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. We covered off why you don't want to do that. And this is important here. At a minimum rent to be determined between the landlord and tenant, but in no event shall it be less than the rent paid in the last year of the original term. Why is that a problem? Market rent, oh, possibly. Possibly, but I'm thinking about something else. When you, because you're dentists, because you guys are great tenants for a lot of landlords, they're going to try to entice you into signing that lease and to get you into your into their premise, into their property. And they're going to do this by offering up a tenant improvement allowance. And this is a cash inducement that they give to you guys to help you with the build-out costs of your practice. But it's not a gift. A lot of dentists tend to think that that's a gift. And oh, look, I negotiated a great deal. I got $120,000 of tenant improvement dollars from the landlord. What a great deal. But in fact, what the landlords have done is they've calculated a repayment of that tenant improvement dollars into your base rent so that by the time your lease term expires, they have received all of that tenant inducement dollars back with interest. And then if you exercise that option to renew, and as it stipulates here, the rent can't be any less than what you paid in the last year of the original term, and you exercise that option, you're going to pay that tenant improvement allowance back twice. It's not uncommon for me to have run across one of your colleagues who are later in their careers where they've actually paid back their tenant improvement dollars 3 or 4 times. Now, I don't mind taking money from the landlord. Just know what it's costing you. It should be paid back in the way of a separate loan facility and shouldn't be calculated into the base rent. Or if it is, when you come to exercise that option to renew, it should back out that original tenant improvement dollars. So it could say, it won't be any less than what you paid in the last year of the original term, less whatever it was, $3 or $4 per square foot, which was calculated into the base rent for repayment of the original tenant improvement dollars. That's important stuff to remember because that's could end up costing you hundreds of thousands of dollars down the road. You didn't mention, but a few years ago, I bought the master franchise rights for Johnny Rockets, which I'm developing out in Canada. And I'm building out dozens of restaurants right now. And when I'm negotiating those leases, I spend a whole lot of time on this section. And those leases don't come up for 10 years, but I know the value of my brand in Canada is going to be very much tied into these options to renew. Now, the good news for me is I know my competition up there have not done this. And I know that at some point in time, I'm going to have a big competitive advantage because my competition, who I know full well, has options to renew that are tied into market, that have TI dollars calculated into the base rents. They're going to be in for quite the shock when it comes time to renew those leases. So you want to eliminate this right out of the gate when you negotiate up front. Yes?
Landlords held by law to show in their calculations that tenant improvement?
That is a great question. Are landlords required by law to show you the calculations for the tenant improvement allowance? Absolutely not.
If you request them, do they have to be?
No.
So how do you know?
You have to go about it. And the question is, how do you know what's been calculated in there? If you're taking a tenant improvement allowance, it's being calculated in, plain and simple. So the way I go about doing it, for example, when I'm negotiating for my Johnny Rockets up in Canada, is I ask the landlord, what are the rents if I don't take any TI dollars? If I just take the premises as is and we do our own build outs because we have the money for it, what's the base rent going to be? And then that should give you an idea. What you're trying to get to, doctor, is you're trying to get to what's called in the industry is the net effective rent, or NER. You could even ask the landlord, what is the net effective rent? They'll be shocked that you know that, but it'll show that they're not going to be able to pull a fast one on you. So far, so good? Okay, so here we are. It shall be less than or pay the original term. If the landlord and tenant are unable to agree on the market rent within 60 days of the exercise by the tenant of its option to renew, the rent shall then be determined by arbitration based on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building. That is the kiss of death, because the last tenant that renewed in the building could be Starbucks. They're on the corner spot 3 floors below you, and their rents could be astronomical. Why should yours be tied into that? The way I like to say it is it can be market rent, but in no event will that rent be more than 15% greater than what you paid in the last year of the original term. So you want to cap off the amount of rent that the landlord can increase by when you exercise that option to renew. Otherwise, it's open-ended. I've seen dentists who have exercised their options to renew only to find out that the landlord is doubling the rents. And that can hurt. At the end of a 10-year lease term and you're exercising an option, that could be a big disadvantage for you. Any questions before I move on with that? For you new guys who are opening up practices in the near term, does this resonate a little bit with you? You see why this is such an important provision to support the longevity of your practice? Net effective rent, the question that you're asking is, what is the landlord getting net from your lease deal before any tenant improvement dollars are built, before the landlord has to put any money into your premises? So now it can be more than just tenant improvement dollars. The landlord might say, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a 10-ton HVAC unit. I will give you demising walls. I'll give you a whole bunch of landlords or tenants work, if you will, and they'll bump the rent up accordingly, 6 and 1/2 dozen the other. And by the way, there's a big difference between landlord's work and tenant's work, and maybe it's not usually in my presentation, but because so many of you are going to be opening up leases, quick definition on that. If the landlord, a lot of landlords try to suggest that tenant's work or landlord's work is actually tenant's work. And so anything that is affixed to the property, anything that can remain the property of the landlord at the end of term, which that landlord can use for any other tenant regardless of use, is considered landlord's work. So we stop and think about that for a minute. That's a lot. That's electrical, that's HVAC, that's flooring, that's bathrooms, those are doors, windows, T-bar ceiling, so on and so forth. If they try to convince you that that is tenant's work, that's incorrect in my mind. And that's where you have to negotiate to make sure that tenant's work is specifically work that is going into your premise to for your specific use for the practice of dentistry. So this would be your operatories. This would be all the plumbing that goes in. Maybe a bump in the electrical because you guys need what? They need 200 amp usually. What 3-phase electric, where some other office tenants would need stuff like that. So no questions. I will go on. I want to talk about the assignment clause because this is the actual provision in the lease that's going to allow you to sell your practice. And again, it's one of the most important provisions in the lease. If you ever want your practice to be worth something to sell. And by the way, you may not sell when you retire. You may decide that if you are getting married to somebody who's living out on the East Coast, you may want to sell your practice a lot sooner than you expect so you can move elsewhere in the country. There's a lot of reasons why dentists sell their practices long before they retire. And if this provision isn't done carefully, that is going to be an impediment to you. Just like we did before, I'm going to let you read through this for a couple of minutes. I'll stop talking. See if you can pick out where the big risks are in it. It's easy when this stuff is up on a PowerPoint presentation because I can show it to you right here. But if anybody had an actual lease agreement, they're 40, 50, sometimes 60 pages in length, and you got to find that buried in there, usually 33 sections into the lease agreement, and it's difficult to pick out, and it can be worded in a variety of different ways. It doesn't have to be this obvious, but it can say the exact same thing, but being a lot more uh, clever about it, which I see happening more and more. What are the big problems that you see with this? Yes. Landlord has overwhelming ability to agree to an assignment or not. What else do you see in here? Yeah, the rents can go up. What else? What? That's right. The original tenant stays on the hook. In fact, that's a matter of common law. So that doesn't even have to be written into the lease. There are other issues around that. But I'm looking for one specific thing.
I don't know if I'm going to catch what it is that you're looking for, but essentially what they're saying is that we have all of the power, but we're also going to give you all the responsibility. So they're kind of doing both. They've got to do both hands.
You've seen this presentation before. Landlord can terminate your lease on the mere request for an assignment. If the tenant should wish to assign or sublet the lease premises, it shall first have received the consent of the landlord. Any request for such consent shall be in writing. Within 15 days after the receipt by the landlord of such request for consent, the landlord shall have the option to either terminate the lease or revise the minimum rent upwards. Why does the landlord want the right to terminate the lease? What's their thinking here? Leverage, perhaps? What do they do with this provision?